This is an ABC News special report.
And good evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan Betts at ABC News World Headquarters in New York. We are interrupting our programming to bring you some breaking news. ABC News has learned that longtime Cuban leader Fidel Castro has died. He was 90 years old. His death was announced by his brother Raul on Cuban state television just a few moments ago. Fidel Castro ruled Cuba for close to 50 years, seizing power in the Cuban Revolution of 1959 before eventually handing over control to his brother Raul in 2008. ABC's Jim Avila has more on the life of the revolutionary figure.
For a half-century, Fidel Castro ruled Cuba while the world changed around him. 50 years of isolation finally ended only after he left power, and only with his tacit blessing. Castro remained skeptical and suspicious of the U.S. right up to his death, defiantly commenting after President Obama's historic visit that Cuba will never forget the Bay of Pigs invasion and does not need America. His defense of his communist revolution never faltering.
I am a communist, a Marxist, socialist communist. I am not afraid to say I am a communist.
Fidel Castro was born in 1926 out of wedlock to a wealthy Cuban landowner and his maid. He went to Catholic schools and then studied law. His two passions were baseball, he was very good at it, and politics. He became an activist for the poor and working class. In 1956, after being expelled by Cuba's American-supported dictator Fulgencio Batista, Castro returned secretly with his brother Raul, Argentinian Marxist rebel leader Che Guevara, and others. They hid out in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, from which they waged a guerrilla war.
The road to Havana paved with glory for rebel chieftain Fidel Castro.
Castro finally expelled Batista and took over. Fidel had promised democracy, but squashed all dissent with jail or expulsions, even executions. He nationalized all U.S. businesses. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy, just elected, approved the CIA-trained invasion force of 1,300 Cuban exiles who went ashore at the Bay of Pigs. Castro demolished them, a huge propaganda victory. In 1962, American spy planes discovered Castro had let the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Yes, we were very close to the nuclear war, extremely close.
Ultimately, the Soviets removed the missiles. Fidel continued to promote leftist movements in Latin America, where he remained popular until his death. Even Castro's critics praised his advances in healthcare and in education. But the inefficiency of Cuba's Soviet-style economy produced dissent. In 1980, more than 125,000 Cubans, some expelled, many allowed to just leave, braved rough seas and dehydration to come to the United States in the Mariel boat lift. In the early 1990s, the fall of the USSR cost Cuba billions of dollars in Soviet aid and trade, leading to widespread shortages and rationing.
La desaparición de la Unión Soviética.
With the demise of the Soviet Union, we have suffered the equivalent to a treason. We have felt betrayed.
Castro fought back by courting tourism and business. In 2006, just before intestinal surgery, he gave up power temporarily to his younger brother Raul. He never took the reins again, made it official in 2008, but he was not totally gone. Started writing newspaper columns, receiving visitors, including Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. Then suddenly, in the summer of 2010, he began displaying his indomitable drive again in public, giving TV interviews, laying flowers at the tomb of the fallen, exhorting the communist youth, and addressing the Cuban parliament. Now the world will see how a new era of Cuban-American diplomacy changes his island home, with Fidel Castro gone, and the Americans gradually returning. It may be no longer Fidel Castro's Cuba.
And ABC's Jim Avila now joins us on the phone. Jim has been to Cuba many, many times. Now, Jim, this, of course, comes just after those historic thawing of relations between Cuba and the United States. How do you think this might now affect change in Cuba?
Well, I think that it'll continue on the same course at this point. I think the changes in the United States actually might have more effect on what's going on in Cuba today than the change with Fidel Castro. Because while Fidel Castro was considered, even to this date, the George Washington of his country among those who remain in Cuba, he was also a very divisive figure. And he has recently sort of faded into the woodwork. Raul Castro has taken over, and Raul Castro really has been running the day-to-day government, and Fidel has not. Fidel has been doing really is writing, trying to be the conscience of Cuba more than the ruler of Cuba. But he remains, to his death, a very important figure. And while he was, because of his nationalism, because of what he meant to the people, he meant that Cuba would not be dominated by the United States, even though the United States is so big and so close.
And so, Jim, looking at this, and we're looking at the historic footage of Fidel Castro, and you can't help but think about his legacy after all these years. What do you think will be the word of historians when they look back at the life of Fidel Castro?
Well, I think he'll be the most prominent figure in Cuba, perhaps only overshadowed a little bit by Jose Marti, who was the author who, in the 1900s, wrote about Cuba becoming free. But Fidel Castro changed the course of Cuba. He changed the way Cuba was. In 1959 and 1958, Cuba was pretty much a satellite of the United States, run by the United States, run by the United States mafia. All those casinos and all that lively dance footage we see of Cuba, that was all run by the mafia, the United States mafia. And Castro came in and he cleaned that out. And not only did he do that, he's revered in his country, in Cuba, for changing the class system. There was a huge class system in Cuba up until then. And the peasant class didn't know how to read or write. Most of the people in Cuba didn't know how to read and write in 1960. And in fact, they didn't have medical care of any kind. And they didn't have electricity outside of Havana. So Castro came into power. He spent money on those things. They have a very good education system. They have a very good medical system. And they have electricity all over the island. Do they have all the freedoms that the United States have? They do not, and the people there want those freedoms, and that's why many of them will be happy to see Castro gone right now, but it will not change his place in history.
I imagine a lot of people will be celebrating that news without question. We just saw a few moments ago video of Raul Castro making that announcement just a few short moments ago that Fidel Castro, the longtime leader of Cuba, has died at the age of 90. Our Jonathan Karl is also on the phone with us. And Jonathan, I mean, Cuba and Castro have been such a fixture in a foreign policy for the United States. This is certainly going to resonate in Washington.
Absolutely. I mean, Fidel Castro is the nemesis of so many presidents. When you think he survived 11 different American presidents, each of them since Kennedy saw Castro as an enemy of the United States, as an abuser of human rights. He was somebody who loomed large because he was an enemy just 90 miles from the shores of the United States. Somebody who was allied with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, outlasted the Cold War. Somebody who looms and has loomed incredibly large in a large chunk of American history going back to 1959.
Yeah, and Jonathan, with President Obama deciding to try to warm relations with Cuba and with the Castro family after all these years, how much hope is there in Washington that Raul Castro might make some real changes that the United States would welcome?
Well, there's not much hope from U.S. policymakers that there would be significant change under Raul Castro, but there certainly has been a major change in U.S. policy that was initiated by President Obama. Something he went a place that again no American president since Kennedy really thought of going, of reestablishing relations. Reopening an embassy in Cuba. It's the stated goal of President Obama to lift the trade embargo on Cuba. But Raul Castro has effectively been leading Cuba for a decade now, and there have certainly been changes in the island. There's been a more opening up of the economic system, the willingness on the behalf of Castro to engage, Raul Castro to engage in the United States, but effectively the real change that has been expected and predicted and urged by so many U.S. political figures. The belief is that would have to come not just after Fidel Castro, but after Raul Castro as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how much has changed in that country in such a relatively short amount of time. Now, Jim, as we mentioned, you have spent a lot of time in Cuba. Raul, as we mentioned, has been in charge for several years now. What do you think may happen next, and how do you think this might impact Raul's rule?
Well, I think that first of all, I don't think Raul Castro will make the dramatic changes beyond what's going on now. The opening of tourism, some economic issues that are opening more, but not even huge economic advances under Raul Castro. I think what's been going on is that Cuba is waiting. The Cuban island itself is waiting for Raul Castro as well to pass away. And then when Raul Castro passes away, then the next generation of leadership is really the one where they expect some kind of changes. Now, there have been people in Miami and in the United States who have worried all along, or who have been cheering on for Fidel's death, because they believe that the Cubans will revolt as soon as they see an opening, and there'll be another revolution against Raul because Fidel's no longer there. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think there's any chance of that happening. I think that the Cuban government and the Cuban military still has a strong hold on that island, and it would be very difficult. There are no weapons in that island besides those who are owned by the military. There's no way it would be very difficult for there to be a revolution there now. It's going to be years before there's any significant change. Fidel Castro remains the symbol of freedom from the United States for many of the people there, or the symbol of independence. I've seen him. I've been to Cuba about 35 times. I met him personally 2 or 3 times while he was still in office. He was a hero then to the people who are in the streets, who were allowed to walk around with him and see him. He had a status above all others in that country. Not popular in this country among Cuban Americans, but in Cuba, very popular.
And for those of us just joining us again, ABC News has learned longtime Cuban leader Fidel Castro has died at the age of 90. His death was announced just a short time ago on Cuban state TV by his brother Raul. Fidel Castro ruled Cuba for close to 50 years, seizing power in the Cuban Revolution of 1959, before, as we mentioned, handing power over to his brother Raul in 2008. So the world will now see how a new era of Cuban-American diplomacy changes that island, with Fidel Castro now gone and the Americans gradually returning, as we've mentioned. It may no longer be Fidel Castro's Cuba, as we've talked about. And so John, as we look at this and as the news develops over the coming hours and overnight into tomorrow, what do you expect the reaction to be in Cuba, but also in the United States?
Well, I think the most interesting thing to watch will be President Obama, who made such a bold and controversial move in reopening official diplomatic ties with Cuba. 'Cause even before Obama made that step, made that move, there was the handshake not with Fidel. He never personally one-on-one met Fidel Castro, but he had a handshake with Raul Castro. It came at Nelson Mandela's memorial in South Africa, and it was a simple gesture, but it was seen as but by many in the U.S. political world as incredibly controversial. because Castro, even though the Cold War had long been gone, still remained this incredibly powerful symbol. So it'll be interesting to see what the White House does. The president never had the opportunity, and probably would have turned down the opportunity to actually personally meet with Fidel. But he did work with his brother, and he did reestablish ties, and he did become the first American president to step foot on Cuban soil in 88 years. So I assume we'll see some kind of a tip of the hat to Fidel Castro, but a recognition that even at this late point, he remained an incredibly controversial figure in the U.S. political world.
Incredibly controversial and incredibly polarizing. Without question, a chapter has ended in the Cuban-United States relations. Jonathan Karl, Jim Avila, thank you so much for your time tonight. Again, those of you just joining us, longtime Cuban leader Fidel Castro has died at the age of 90. Stay tuned to these ABC News stations for more on this developing story. We will have full details on Nightline for those of you on the west coast of the United States, and much more on Good Morning America. And of course, you can always find the latest at abcnews.com. I'm Jonathan Betts at ABC News World Headquarters in New York. Have a good night.
This has been a special report from ABC News.